In the grim stalemate of 1915, the world desperately sought a way around the Western Front. A bold, audacious plan was hatched: strike at the soft underbelly of the Ottoman Empire, force open a lifeline to Russia, and change the entire course of the Great War. Today, we explore a campaign born of strategic necessity, but defined by calamitous execution. A land where ambition met impossible terrain, and generations of young men paid the ultimate price. This is the crucible that forged nations. This is the Gallipoli Campaign. In the winter of 1915, the armies of Europe were dying in mud. The Western Front, that cursed line of trenches stretching from the English Channel to Switzerland, had become a graveyard. Millions of men faced each other across a landscape of barbed wire and shell craters, trading lives for yards of blood-soaked ground. At Ypres, at the Marne, at 100 forgotten fields, the flower of a generation was being ground to nothing. And the generals, those architects of slaughter, had no answer. Attack brought death. Defense brought stalemate. And so the war settled into its grim mathematics: more men, more shells, more corpses. But in London, in the wood-panelled offices of the Admiralty, one man believed he had found a way to break the deadlock. His name was Winston Churchill. He was 40 years old, ambitious, brilliant, and, as events would prove, catastrophically wrong. Churchill's plan was seductive in its simplicity. Why bash your head against the German trenches when you could strike at the soft underbelly of the Central Powers? The Ottoman Empire, that ancient, decaying power that had thrown its lot in with Germany and Austria-Hungary, stretched across the eastern Mediterranean. And at its heart lay a geographic prize: the Dardanelles Strait, a narrow ribbon of water connecting the Mediterranean to the Sea of Marmara and onward to the Black Sea and Russia. If the Royal Navy could force the Dardanelles, Churchill argued, the entire strategic picture would transform. Constantinople, the Ottoman capital, would fall under Allied guns. The Turks would sue for peace. A supply route to Russia would open, revitalizing the Eastern Front. The neutral Balkans might join the Allies. Resources and attention would bleed away from the Western Front. It was, Churchill promised, the war-winning stroke. A few old battleships, some daring, and the war would crack wide open. It was the kind of plan that looked brilliant on a map in London. It appealed to politicians weary of the Western Front's carnage. It appealed to naval officers who wanted the Royal Navy, not the army, to win the war. But it had one fatal flaw: it assumed the enemy would cooperate. On February 19, 1915, the naval bombardment began. British and French warships, HMS Queen Elizabeth, HMS Inflexible, the French Suffren, thundered their great guns against the Ottoman forts guarding the Dardanelles. The initial results seemed promising. Outer forts were silenced. Minesweepers began the dangerous work of clearing the strait. Churchill's plan appeared to be working. But the Ottomans, written off as a spent force, were preparing. German military advisors helped lay minefields in the narrowest stretches of the strait. Coastal artillery batteries were repositioned, camouflaged, and reinforced. And the Ottoman soldiers manning these defenses, men the British High Command dismissed as backwards peasants, proved to be stubborn, courageous, and deadly. March 18, 1915, the day of reckoning. A combined Allied fleet of 16 battleships and battlecruisers steamed into the Dardanelles to force the Narrows. It was the largest naval assault of the war. The guns roared. Shells weighing hundreds of pounds tore into Ottoman positions. For hours, it seemed the sheer weight of British firepower would prevail. And then the mines struck. The French battleship Bouvet hit a mine at 12:54 p.m. She capsized in less than 2 minutes, taking more than 600 men to the bottom. HMS Irresistible struck another mine, dead in the water, abandoned. HMS Ocean, attempting a rescue, also hit a mine and sank. HMS Inflexible was badly damaged. The pride of the Royal Navy, those steel leviathans that were supposed to stride through the Dardanelles like gods, were stopped cold by mines costing pennies apiece and guns manned by soldiers Britain had not thought worth fearing. By nightfall, the naval attack was over. 1/3 of the Allied fleet was sunk or crippled. The plan to force the Dardanelles by naval power alone, Churchill's great gamble, had failed. Worse, it had alerted the Ottomans that an attack was coming. Surprise, that most precious military asset, was squandered. The Turks now knew exactly where the blow would fall, and they had weeks to prepare. But the plan was not abandoned. It was expanded. If the navy could not do it alone, then the army would land on the Gallipoli Peninsula itself, silence the forts from land, and open the strait by force. What had begun as a relatively low-cost naval operation was about to become one of the bloodiest campaigns of the Great War. Commanding the Ottoman defenses was a man the Allies did not yet know, but would soon learn to respect and fear. His name was Mustafa Kemal. A 40-year-old lieutenant colonel, brilliant, driven, and contemptuous of his own superiors, Kemal had been posted to the Gallipoli Peninsula with the 19th Division. He studied the terrain. He drilled his men. And he waited. The Allies were coming, and the peninsula would be ready. The force assembled to storm the Gallipoli Peninsula was vast and diverse. The British 29th Division, regulars, professionals, many veterans of colonial wars. The French Corps Expeditionnaire d'Orient, assigned to make a diversionary landing. And the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the Anzacs, young volunteers from the far side of the world, eager for glory, most of whom had never heard a shot fired in anger. They were commanded by General Sir Ian Hamilton, a courtly, literary man who was brave, charming, and utterly unsuited to the brutal calculus of modern war. Hamilton was given vague orders, inadequate maps, and no idea of the true strength of the Ottoman defenses. His staff was riddled with aristocratic incompetence appointed for their connections rather than their ability. It was, in short, a recipe for disaster. April 25, 1915. Dawn. The day of the landings. At Cape Helles, the southern tip of the peninsula, British and French troops clambered into their landing boats and pulled for shore. 5 beaches, designated V, W, X, Y, and S, would be assaulted simultaneously. At Beach X and Y, the landings went relatively smoothly. At Beach S, the French made good progress in their diversionary role. But at V Beach and W Beach, the critical points, the men rode into hell. The Ottomans had fortified every inch of these beaches. Machine guns were pre-sighted on the landing zones. Barbed wire ran into the water. Trenches honeycombed the cliffs. And as the first boats grounded and the British soldiers stumbled into the shallows, the Ottoman defenders opened fire. The SS River Clyde, a collier converted into a makeshift landing ship, packed with 2,000 men, ran aground at V Beach. Ramps were thrown down. Men poured out. And the machine guns tore them apart. Bodies fell into the water. The sea turned red. Men tried to use the corpses of their comrades as cover. The slaughter was so complete that the beach was later called V Beach, the Beach of Blood. Of the first 200 men to land, only 21 reached cover alive. At W Beach, Lancashire Landing, the carnage was just as terrible. The Lancashire Fusiliers waded ashore into a storm of fire. Men fell in the water, weighted down by their packs, and drowned. Others made it to the beach only to be cut down by enfilade fire they couldn't see and couldn't escape. By the end of the day, the Lancashires had suffered 600 casualties. 6 Victoria Crosses were awarded, 6 VCs before breakfast, as the bitter saying went. They had won the beach, but at a cost that would haunt the survivors. But if Cape Helles was a charnel house, the landing at Anzac Cove, 12 miles north, was something stranger and worse, a magnificent disaster born of a single, catastrophic error. The Anzacs, 16,000 Australians and New Zealanders, were supposed to land at Garbar-Teep, a gently sloping beach that would have allowed them to push inland toward the critical high ground of Sari Bear Ridge. But in the pre-dawn darkness, a combination of strong currents, poor navigation, and sheer bad luck carried the landing boats a mile north of their intended beach. The men came ashore not at Gallipoli, but at the base of steep, broken, scrub-covered ridges that the maps had barely shown and the planners had never properly scouted. The Anzacs scrambled up the cliffs in the half-light, moving inland with courage and chaos in equal measure. There was no plan anymore, just small groups of men pushing up gullies and ridges, trying to find the high ground, trying to find the enemy. Ottoman resistance was initially light. For a few hours, it seemed the Anzacs might actually seize the heights. And then Mustafa Kemal arrived. Kemal was stationed inland with the 19th Division, held in reserve. But when he heard the sound of firing from the coast, he did not wait for orders. He gathered the nearest battalion, the 57th Infantry Regiment, and force-marched them toward the sound of the guns. When he reached the ridges above Anzac Cove and saw Ottoman soldiers retreating, he stopped them with fury and force of will. "You cannot run away from the enemy," he shouted. "We have no ammunition," they replied. "If you have no ammunition, you have your bayonets." And he ordered them to fix bayonets and lie down in a line, as if preparing to attack. The retreating Ottomans stopped. The advancing Anzacs, seeing the bayonets glinting on the ridge, stopped as well. And in that pause, Kemal brought up reinforcements, machine guns, artillery, fresh battalions, and launched a series of ferocious counterattacks that drove the Anzacs back toward the beach. By nightfall on April 25th, the pattern of the entire campaign was set. The Allies had their beachheads, narrow, exposed, dominated by Ottoman guns on the heights. But they could not break out. At Cape Helles, the British were pinned against the cliffs. At Anzac Cove, the Australians and New Zealanders clung to steep gullies and ridges, unable to advance, unwilling to retreat. Thousands were dead or wounded. And the Ottomans, written off as a pushover, had fought with a skill and determination that shocked the Allied command. The campaign that was supposed to be over in weeks had become a siege. And the men on both sides were about to learn what that meant. Within days of the landings, the dream of a swift breakthrough died. The front lines, at Cape Helles, at Anzac Cove, ossified into trenches. Not the elaborate, deep networks of the Western Front, but crude, shallow scratches in the rocky soil, separated from the Ottoman trenches by distances so short that men could hear the enemy talking, singing, praying. At some points, the lines were 15 yards apart. Grenades were thrown back and forth. Snipers ruled. To show your head was to die. The generals called it a temporary setback. The men in the trenches knew better. The stalemate that the Dardanelles plan was supposed to avoid had simply been transplanted to a godforsaken peninsula at the edge of the world. But if the trenches of Gallipoli resembled the Western Front, the environment did not. This was not the mud of Flanders. This was something uniquely, brutally, punishing. Summer arrived. The Aegean sun beat down on the treeless ridges with savage intensity. Temperatures climbed to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no shade. The trenches became ovens. Men collapsed from heat stroke. Uniforms rotted. Boots fell apart. And above all, there was the thirst. Water was scarce. What little there was had to be brought up from the beaches in cans, rationed, hoarded. Men learned to drink their urine. They learned to lick the dew off rocks. Some went mad from thirst before they were ever touched by a bullet. The Ottomans, holding the high ground, controlled what few wells existed. The Allies suffered. And then there were the flies. Millions of them. Fat, bloated, feeding on the corpses rotting in no man's land, on the latrines, on the wounded. They swarmed over food, over water, over sleeping men's faces. They spread disease with an efficiency no Ottoman bullet could match. Dysentery swept through the Allied trenches. Men lost 20, 30, 40 pounds. They shat blood. They died of dehydration and infection in fetid hospital tents where the flies ruled and the doctors had no cure. By midsummer, more men were being evacuated for disease than for wounds. Typhus, enteric fever, frostbite when winter came, these were the enemies that killed as surely as the Ottomans. But they earned no medals, and the generals who created the conditions for these plagues faced no reckoning. And through it all, the snipers. Ottoman marksmen, patient and skilled, who made every trip to a latrine, every movement in daylight, a gamble with death. Men learned to move only at night, to crawl, to freeze at the slightest sound. The psychological toll was immense. There was no rest, no safety, no moment when you could forget that a bullet might find you. The generals, far from the flies and the heat, kept planning offensives. At Cape Helles, the British launched a series of attacks in late April and May. The First Battle of Krithia, the Second Battle of Krithia, the Third Battle of Krithia, trying to break through the Ottoman lines and seize the village that dominated the southern peninsula. Each attack followed the same script: a brief artillery bombardment, a brave charge, a wall of Ottoman machine gun fire, and a retreat littered with dead. The village of Krithia, a miserable cluster of stone houses, was never taken. Thousands died trying. By July, it was clear that the campaign was failing. But instead of cutting losses, the British government decided to double down. Reinforcements were sent. A new offensive was planned. This time, the strategy was ambitious: simultaneous attacks at Cape Helles and Anzac Cove to pin the Ottomans, combined with a fresh landing at Suvla Bay, just north of Anzac Cove, where new troops would come ashore, seize the high ground, and roll up the Ottoman defenses from the flank. It was, on paper, the kind of bold, coordinated operation that could break the stalemate. In reality, it was a farce. The August offensive began on the night of August 6, 1915. At Anzac Cove, the Australians and New Zealanders launched a desperate assault on the heights of Chunuk Bair and Hill 971, part of the Sari Bair range they had failed to take on the first day. They attacked at night, through terrain so broken and confusing that units lost their way in the dark. Some New Zealanders actually reached the crest of Chunuk Bair at dawn on August 7th, the only Allied troops in the entire campaign to reach the commanding heights. They could see the Dardanelles glittering below. For a moment, victory seemed possible. And then Mustafa Kemal personally led a counterattack that drove them off the ridge. The New Zealanders, exhausted, outnumbered, and unsupported, were annihilated. Chunuk Bair was lost. The heights would never be reached again. At Suvla Bay, the story was even worse. 20,000 British troops, new, untested divisions, landed on the night of August 6th against almost no opposition. The beaches were wide. The ground was open. The nearest Ottoman forces were miles away. For 12 critical hours, the path to the high ground, Tek Teep, was open. If the British had moved quickly, they could have seized it, dominated the peninsula, and changed the course of the campaign. Instead, they did nothing. The British Corps commander at Suvla, Lieutenant General Frederick Stopford, was 61 years old, had not seen combat in decades, and was far more concerned with establishing a secure base than with exploiting success. His subordinates were little better. Troops sat on the beach, brewed tea, went for swims. Officers debated. Messengers got lost. And the hours ticked by. By the time Stopford's men finally began to move inland, the Ottomans, alerted, reinforced, and led by commanders who understood the value of speed, had occupied the heights. What should have been an unopposed march became another blood-soaked assault against entrenched defenders. Stopford was relieved of command, but the damage was done. The August offensive, the last great hope of the Gallipoli Campaign, collapsed in confusion, incompetence, and blood. Thousands more were dead. The trenches remained. The stalemate endured. By autumn, the men in the trenches had stopped believing in victory. They endured. At Anzac Cove, soldiers carved out better dugouts, built improvised piers, created a strange, subterranean city of tunnels and shelters clinging to the cliffs. They swam in the sea under Ottoman sniper fire, a brief escape from the filth and fear. They wrote letters home that the censors cut to ribbons. They buried their friends in shallow graves and tried not to think about winter. At Cape Helles, the British and French held their lines with grim determination. Patrols went out into no man's land. Raids were launched, small, vicious affairs fought with grenades and knives in the dark. Men won medals for acts of suicidal bravery that accomplished nothing. The generals, far away, kept promising that one more push, one more attack, would do it. The men in the trenches knew they were liars. And on the Ottoman side, the suffering was just as great. The Turks held the high ground, but they paid for it in blood. Their trenches were just as filthy, their rations just as poor, their wounded just as doomed. They too died of disease, of snipers, of the endless shelling from Allied warships offshore. Mustafa Kemal, now a national hero, drove his men with merciless discipline, launching counterattacks that spent lives like water to ensure the Allies could never break out. The Ottomans were winning, but it felt like drowning. By November, as the rains came and the first snows dusted the ridges, the truth was undeniable. The Gallipoli Campaign had failed. The Dardanelles would not be forced. Constantinople would not fall. The war would not be shortened. All that remained was to count the cost and to decide whether to admit defeat. In late autumn 1915, the British government finally faced reality. The Gallipoli Campaign was a failure. Reinforcements could not change that. The Western Front demanded men and resources. The political will to sustain the bleeding on the peninsula was gone. The question was no longer whether to evacuate, but how, and whether it could be done without turning defeat into catastrophe. The evacuation of Gallipoli would be the campaign's only unqualified success. The withdrawal was planned with a care and professionalism that had been absent from every other aspect of the campaign. The goal was to pull over 100,000 men off the peninsula, from Anzac Cove, from Suvla Bay, from Cape Helles, without the Ottomans realizing what was happening until it was too late. If the Turks discovered the evacuation while it was underway and launched an all-out assault, the beaches would become killing grounds. The slaughter would dwarf anything that had come before. The plan relied on deception. For weeks, the Allies maintained normal routines. Patrols went out. Guns fired on schedule. Supplies were landed and then quietly removed at night. Gradually, imperceptibly, the garrisons shrank. Silent stunts were practiced. Entire units would vanish from their trenches for hours, training the Ottomans to ignore temporary quiet. Rifles were rigged with dripping cans that would pull triggers after the men were gone, giving the illusion of continued occupation. On the night of December 18th to 19th, 1915, the final evacuations from Suvla Bay and Anzac Cove began. In absolute silence, men filed down to the beaches. Piers were dismantled. Guns were spiked. Stores that couldn't be carried were destroyed. By dawn, the trenches were empty. The Ottomans, when they finally realized the Allies were gone, rushed forward and found nothing but abandoned positions and booby traps. Not a single man was lost in the evacuation of Anzac Cove and Suvla Bay. It was a miracle of planning and execution, a bitter counterpoint to the blunders that had defined the rest of the campaign. At Cape Helles, the withdrawal was more dangerous. The Ottoman commanders, learning from the northern evacuations, were watching closely. The British and French troops held their positions until January 8th to 9th, 1916, the last men leaving under the cover of darkness and a carefully orchestrated artillery barrage. Again, the evacuation succeeded. A handful of men were lost to accidents and shelling, but there was no massacre. By January 9th, 1916, the Gallipoli Peninsula was abandoned. The campaign was over. The cost was staggering. The Allies suffered over 250,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing, dead of disease. The British Empire lost over 120,000 men. The French nearly 50,000. The Anzacs, Australians and New Zealanders suffered over 35,000 casualties, including 8,700 Australians and 2,700 New Zealanders killed. For small, distant nations, the loss was proportionally immense. The Ottoman Empire suffered just as terribly. Estimates of their casualties range from 250,000 to over 300,000. The peninsula became a graveyard for Turkish soldiers as surely as it did for the Allies. The young men who stopped the invasion paid in blood for every ridge, every trench, every yard of scorched earth. And what was gained? Nothing. The Dardanelles remained closed. The Ottoman Empire stayed in the war. The supply route to Russia was never opened. The stalemate on the Western Front continued for 3 more years. Gallipoli changed nothing, except the lives it destroyed. The political fallout was swift. Winston Churchill, the campaign's chief architect, was forced to resign from the Admiralty in May 1915, even before the final failure was complete. He would spend the rest of his life defending the Gallipoli plan, arguing that it had been a good idea ruined by poor execution. He was half right. The execution was indeed catastrophic, but the strategy, too, was flawed from the start. No amount of naval guns or bravery could overcome the fundamental problem. The Ottomans were defending their homeland, and they would not break easily. Sir Ian Hamilton, the Allied commander, was quietly removed and never given another significant command. Frederick Stopford, the bumbling corps commander at Suvla Bay, was sent into retirement. But none of the senior officers faced real accountability. No courts-martial. No inquiries that mattered. The men who sent tens of thousands to their deaths went home to comfortable pensions and wrote memoirs blaming each other. But if Gallipoli was a military failure, it became something else, something larger, in the memory of the nations that fought there. For Australia and New Zealand, Gallipoli became the defining moment of national identity. The Anzac legend, the story of young men from the far side of the world, brave, resourceful, irreverent, fighting and dying in a distant land, became the foundation of how these nations saw themselves. April 25th, Anzac Day, the anniversary of the landing, remains the most solemn day in the Australian and New Zealand calendars, a day of remembrance that honors not victory, but courage, sacrifice, and mateship in the face of futility. For Turkey, Gallipoli, Çanakkale, as it is known in Turkish, was a triumph of national defense. The Ottoman Empire was crumbling, dismissed by the great powers as the sick man of Europe. But at Gallipoli, Turkish soldiers proved they could stand against the mightiest empires in the world. The victory gave the Ottoman people pride, hope, and a hero, Mustafa Kemal, whose leadership on the peninsula would propel him to leadership of the post-war Turkish Republic as Atatürk, father of the Turks. The defense of Gallipoli became the founding myth of modern Turkey. Today, the Gallipoli Peninsula is quiet. The trenches have softened. The barbed wire is gone. The bones of the dead rest in orderly cemeteries, Commonwealth graves, Turkish graves, side by side on the ridges where they killed each other. Tourists walk the beaches. Historians debate what went wrong. And every year, on April 25th, old men and women, fewer each year, travel to Anzac Cove to remember. Gallipoli was a campaign born of strategic desperation and nurtured by command incompetence. It was sold as a bold stroke that would end the war, and it became a grinding 8-month siege that accomplished nothing but slaughter. The generals promised a breakthrough. They delivered a charnel house. But the men who fought there, British, French, Australian, New Zealand, Indian, Turkish, did not fail. They were betrayed by their leaders, abandoned by strategy, and left to die in heat and filth and disease on a peninsula that should never have been assaulted. They fought with courage. They endured with dignity. And they died for nothing. That is the legacy of Gallipoli. Not glory, not victory, but the bitter truth that bravery cannot redeem a bad plan, and that the men who make the plans never pay the price for their failures. By January 1916, the Allied forces had quietly and successfully withdrawn from Gallipoli. But the strategic failure was absolute. Over 250,000 Allied casualties and a similar number for the Ottoman defenders marked one of the most devastating campaigns of the Great War. Politically, it led to Winston Churchill's resignation, Militarily, it proved the enduring power of defensive warfare, even against superior naval might. But for the nations involved, Gallipoli carved a far deeper legacy. For Australians and New Zealanders, it became the defining moment of national identity, the Anzac legend, a tale of courage, mateship, and sacrifice born on foreign soil. For the Turkish, it was a heroic defense of their homeland, propelling Mustafa Kemal to national leadership. The shores of Gallipoli remain a sacred ground, a stark reminder of the tragic human cost when grand strategy collides with brutal reality. If you want to understand the monumental struggles and the profound cultural impact of human conflict, make sure you subscribe to History of Conflicts. Hit that notification bell and leave a comment below. We want to know, do you believe the strategic goal of opening the Dardanelles was worth the immense human cost of the Gallipoli campaign? Thanks for watching.